Good afternoon. Thanks for joining Family Caregiver Alliance Families with Aging Parents. Difficult conversations just got easier. I'm Calvin Hu, Education Coordinator at FCA and your host. For 4 decades, FCA has been working across the Bay Area and the nation to improve the well-being of family caregivers. We offer support through consultations, classes, workshops, publications, retreats, research, and advocacy. If you'd like to learn more about us or access our online resource center, CareNav, please visit caregiver.org. Now for some quick housekeeping during the webinar. Your phones or mics are going to be muted, so if you have any questions, you can ask them by using the Q&A question box on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. And if you do have to leave early, we archive all our webinars and they can be viewed later on at caregiver.org. So I'd like to introduce today's guest, Nicole Lance. Nicole is a family and elder mediator. She's completed the coursework and training recommended by the Association of Conflict Resolution, ACR, which is widely recognized as the nation's premier professional elder mediation association. She's a certified senior advisor, knowledgeable across a broad spectrum of topics relevant to aging adults and their families. In addition to the ACR training, Nicole is a JD. So before becoming a family, elder, mediator, and senior advisor, Nicole practiced business law, which included mediation for 15 years. In addition to her family and elder mediation practice, Nicole currently chairs an ACR task force, which is exploring a joint venture with Stanford University's Center on Advanced Decision-Making and Aging to study the benefits of elder mediation and helping address kind of the needs of adult families. For more information, you can visit Nicole's website, which is mediateforward.com. So now that you know a little bit more about our guest, I'd like to turn it over to Nicole.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Calvin, for that kind introduction. As Calvin mentioned, we can go to the next slide. My name is Nicole Lance, and I speak to you today from Menlo Park, just south of San Francisco. For those of you participating from outside the Bay Area, welcome. Calvin mentioned my professional background as referenced briefly on this slide. If you want to know more, please visit my website. But on a more personal note, to give you a better sense of who I am a family and elder mediator because helping families communicate more effectively and figure out what they need in order to solve problems interests me. Over a lifetime, I've spent considerable time with people who think and act in vastly different ways, and I am naturally curious about the unique and similar ways in which people communicate, make decisions, and solve problems. I am also a people person who loves listening to each person's unique story, especially those of older people who grew up in a different world with so much wisdom to share. So today we're going to look at this roadmap, which lays out the topics covered this morning. And the slide deck is available to anyone who asks for it, so feel free. Let's begin by talking about family conflict as loved ones age. What are the sources of conflict and why are they difficult to resolve? Then we'll move to family meetings, explaining their benefit, initial considerations, structure, and possible outcomes. Next, I'll show you how to think like a mediator as we focus on go back please, to the roadmap. As we focus on 3 core skills, you can see them in the top right, listening, questions, and statements in order to be successful in a family meeting, before addressing 3 special topics. We're still on the slide before, in more depth. And finally, I will describe the elder mediator's secret sauce in resolving conflict and identifying what to look for when hiring an elder mediator. So let's begin with, now we can move on, thank you, difficult conversations. So what is a difficult conversation? It is simply any conversation that is difficult. Perhaps it involves a lot of complexity or arouses uncomfortable feelings. Families can use the structure of a family meeting to work through difficult conversations between and among aging loved ones and other family members. This slide identifies different kinds of professionals who help facilitate these conversations if people don't want to manage the family meeting themselves. And each has a particular bent. Many of you are familiar with aging life care managers, sometimes called GCMs, typically social workers or nurses, who do a wonderful job with assessment, planning, and execution of care plans. Oftentimes, they are also skilled at resolving some level of conflict. And therapists diagnose and treat mental and emotional disorders, often addressing deep psychological pain of individual family members one-on-one. In contrast, elder mediators are professionals who specialize 100% on facilitating difficult family conversations. That's all we do. Together, elder mediators, therapists, geriatric care managers, social workers, we cross-refer and we often work together. So let's take a look at some of the common challenges that make conversation difficult. Here are common areas. Sometimes conflict is among parents and adult children. Sometimes it's just between the adult children. Money. Who pays for what? Who gets it? Sibling wealth disparity. Caregiving. Who's responsible? How does caregiving get done? Safety. Driving. And living at home. Communication. Challenges about how, what, and when information gets shared. And fairness. Rarely are family members in the same position, financially, relationally, or otherwise. And so questions about equity and dividing resources often comes up. So I'd like to take a poll for a minute or two. And if you'd like, chat me your examples of conflict that you see. And let's see how they line up to the ones we already named. I'm just going to give a couple people a minute if anyone wants to share. And then we'll move on. So I'm seeing safety. I'm seeing fairness. Money and who is going to be the caregiver, one caregiver expected to handle it all. I mean, there's so many challenges coming up. I can't even keep up with it. Money, caregiving, safety, communication, family history, siblings disagree, decision makers, conflicts about driving, large family dynamics. So that's a lot. So people are experiencing a lot of challenging who gets what, who takes care of medical care, siblings and COVID, sibling resentment over who does what. Okay, I mean, it's like 40 responses so far. So we see that family conflict is a big deal. Why is it so difficult to resolve? Family conflict is difficult to resolve for many reasons, sometimes because the issues themselves are complicated. For example, whether to move out of the family home, and if so, how and where to. Sometimes it's because the issues bleed into one another, as in the case of financial and legal decisions that are inextricably linked. And sometimes it's because family dynamics are complex, as many of you alluded to. There are strong negative feelings, deeply entrenched behavioral patterns, problematic communication styles. And this complexity explains why some families prefer to use professionals to facilitate family meetings instead of doing it themselves. So can you relate to any of these common responses to family challenges? We've got the deer in headlights. People are not sure what to do, paralyzed by indecision or fear. We've got denial until medical crisis hits, and then everyone is in crisis mode trying to figure out how to respond. And then we've got the chickens looking around, unfocused, a disorganized group, and that describes many of our families. And we've got finally the flight response. Run away fast, just go the opposite direction. That's the response to conflict. Thankfully, there is a better way to resolve family conflict and make constructive decisions. In their terrific book, Mom always liked you best. Nationally recognized elder mediator Crystal Thorpe and her colleagues point out that with thoughtful preparation, and that's the key, ahead of time, family meetings can be an efficient forum for families to sit down together and discuss and resolve tough issues they confront. The goals of the meeting, whether formal or informal, will vary by family. But it is possible to lay a groundwork too for better future communication and improved collaboration. So here is our family. We've got our matriarch, patriarch, and 6 children ready for a family meeting. But seriously, let's talk about some of the initial decisions involved in putting a family meeting together. Participation. Whoever wants to and others agree to. This is a voluntary process. Ideally, all stakeholders have an opportunity for a voice. And it works best when you've got the people with relevant information and those with actual power to make and execute decisions involved. Sometimes you can't get everyone at the table. Though, you may be able to overcome initial hesitation to participate if you can help people understand that participation serves their interests. And sometimes someone who initially is not ready becomes ready a few months later. They just need time to noodle. But ultimately, if someone who needs to be involved says no, there's a limit to how much you can accomplish. With respect to an elder's voice, bullet point 2, it's important to include and support an elder's voice to the extent possible. They may need or want an advocate or a surrogate to help them. We will look at the question of capacity more closely in a minute. An older parent may initially resist the idea of a meeting, worried that someone may try to impose on their independence. But sometimes a polite gesture, even a handwritten note, is appreciated by an older person versus asking them initially on a phone or by text to join in on a family meeting where you've caught them off guard and put them on the spot to respond. Bullet point 3, it's important to set goals for what you want to accomplish during your family meeting. Getting clarity about what you are trying to achieve ahead of time makes it less likely that during a family meeting, people feel stuck and wonder, why am I even here? And what can be accomplished? People come to meetings from vastly different positions and perspectives, so there is a range of possible goals. Usually, people are motivated to convene a family meeting in order to address a substantive challenge, which makes sense. But there can be additional goals other than resolving a substantive issue worth consideration. The goal for a family meeting can be anything from improving or maintaining relationships, getting necessary buy-in for some topic that matters, agreeing about how decisions will be made and roles and responsibilities going forward. For any of these goals to be achieved, and this is key, each person must want what some refer to as a learning conversation. And that's an important concept that we will keep coming back to. As you think about goals for your family meeting, note they can become the basis for a meeting agenda. Moving on to the 4th bullet point. Getting buy-in to ground rules ahead of diving into conversation is important because it sets expectations and gives people something to fall back on if conversation goes astray. Some people like to keep these flexible and short. Other people like to spell out all the particulars. There is no right or wrong approach. One example that people find helpful is to agree in advance to honor one another's right to call foul, or that they will say, ouch, or some other agreed upon signal to indicate that they feel stung by a particular comment. This immediate feedback gives everyone the chance to pause briefly and either deal with the ouch or agree to move on before more damage is done. Beyond ground rules, it's also important to decide who will lead the family meeting. This can present the biggest challenge. What can you do if no one wants to lead? Or someone does, but they probably can't do it well? Or someone wants to who has the technical skills, but not everyone will accept them as leader. What then? Sometimes there are no easy answers. That's a lot to consider in bringing people together, but it can be done with thoughtful planning and discussion over time, ahead of time. But it is precisely for that reason, and many others, that some families seek professional help to organize, prepare, and manage the process of facilitating family meetings. And in the next few slides, we will look at a few of these initial decisions in greater detail, beginning with an elder's participation and the question of capacity. Let's say that your family wants to talk about mom's living situation and care, and the adult children want to involve mom as much as possible in the discussion and decision-making. Their goal is to understand and respect her wishes while taking into consideration possible competing values like safety. But there's a communication challenge because she doesn't seem to understand major issues and choices, or to be able to ask appropriate questions about this important decision. There is a question about capacity, whether mom's got it, for what purpose, and can anything be done to help support it so that she can participate more fully in a family meeting. Capacity is a complicated issue, and experts with years of training and experience still find it difficult to assess, and they disagree about its meaning. And courts certainly reach different conclusions as well. That said, I do want to mention a promising and emerging trend, which is called supported decision-making, which starts from the premise that there is no one definition of capacity that applies to every situation. Mom with early onset dementia may lack capacity to enter into a 50-page legal document, but have capacity in order to discuss and make other decisions. The key insight is to recognize that sometimes a person with questionable capacity can be supported in such a way so as to enable capacity in a given matter. There's an emerging trend to move away from asking, does an elder have or not have capacity, as some static notion, to a more fluid concept called supported decision-making. So instead of asking, does this person have capacity, ask, does the person have capacity with support? And that means asking, what can we do to help an adult with a disability make their own decisions so that they can understand issues, choices, so they can ask questions, and so they can communicate? Next, let's take a closer look at another issue to consider as you put together a family meeting, and that is the agenda. So a couple of slides ago, we talked about the importance of identifying goals for the family meeting and starting to put together an agenda. Here are a few common items that might appear. And from the comments I got when we took the poll, it looks like a lot of these items would make the agenda list. When creating an agenda, it's important to state agenda items neutrally. And if multiple issues exist, and there's no immediate crisis or serious safety concern, you might think of addressing the issues that will raise the least amount of conflict, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And finally, as you think through what a family meeting could look like, also spend time just to make sure that there aren't good reasons altogether to avoid a family meeting. So when might a family meeting not be a good idea? I'll cover 6 examples. 1, if there is a concern about capacity. We just talked about that. 2, if elder abuse is an issue, and that's a separate long talk. 3, if there's no real purpose in meeting and getting together risks setting off emotional triggers and making the situation worse. You don't want to put yourself in a position halfway through a conversation where neither person is quite sure what the point is or what a good outcome would look like. 4, and if your goal in meeting is to try to change people, that's not a good reason to meet. You may want people to be more loving, to show appreciation, to accept your choices, but we can't make these things happen. Changes in attitudes and behavior rarely come from arguments, facts, and attempts to persuade. But engaging someone in a conversation where mutual learning is the goal, what I called before a learning conversation, that does often result in change, and that's what we're here to talk about. And 5, 5th reason to avoid a family meeting, it's worth considering whether in your particular case, actions will speak louder than any words can during a family meeting. In one of my favorite books published by Harvard Negotiation Project called Difficult Conversations, the authors recount a story of a son and mother in conflict after dad dies. Mom wants the son to spend more time at the family farm and possibly take over. And each time she asks, the son becomes more resistant to visiting. He's got his own lives and responsibilities where he lives. But then he considered the full spectrum of her feelings. And he realized that what was behind her always asking him to come was the fact that she missed him deeply. That's why she was always asking him to come. And so he found ways to include her that didn't involve visiting. And all of a sudden, over time, she stopped insisting that he visit, and their relationship grew stronger. And finally, reason 6, why a family meeting may not be a good idea, is if there's conflict within yourself that you should resolve first. For example, let's say that you are fighting with siblings over care and responsibilities, but when you're honest with yourself, you realize that you decided to take on a lot of that responsibility yourself out of your own feelings of obligation and perhaps guilt, not because anyone asked you to. Understanding first your own role in causing the stress and frustration that you feel, and thinking through what you want to do about that before launching into a family meeting puts everyone in a better position to problem solve the remaining issues. But if none of these 6 factors is an issue, and you've put together your family group, you figured out your goals, you've talked through your logistics, then it is time to hold your meeting. Let's go. Family meeting structure. Pre-COVID, family meetings were usually held in person. During COVID, they often take place online, which presents both challenges and opportunities. Technology like Zoom can make it easier for families dealing with geographic distances and other concerns, makes it easier for them to communicate. On the other hand, many people still prefer to talk in person, and that's obviously more difficult now. The good news is that many people who initially resist using Zoom to conduct family meetings now embrace it. They've gotten the instruction and support they need to make it work. And as an aside, when Zoom was in the development phase, the company sought input from mediators. So it's got nice features that improve the flow of family meetings. A family meeting typically begins with the leader welcoming everyone, briefly summarizing in neutral terms what brings everyone together, reviewing ground rules. There's often a conversation about confidentiality. How do people feel about sharing any of what is said with spouses, children, other people? The leader's goal is to make sure that everyone feels centered, ready to proceed without distractions, to have a learning conversation. After the leader's initial comments, typically each party takes a turn speaking, maybe 10 minutes, focusing on their own needs and interests and feelings, not their arguments, positions, or judgments. Next, family members will begin to discuss and agree upon what's on the agenda, and then begin talking about the first agenda item. As we said, often picking the easiest topic first to gain positive momentum. They'll discuss the situation before beginning to examine options, which ones work, what interests they meet, what benefits each option might offer, and the risk involved. There is a lot going on. People are figuring out what topic to tackle first, how decisions will be made, by what standard, using what information, talking about what's fair, and responding to family dynamics along the way. Past history, personalities, different communication styles. And we'll get to those. It's not easy. And again, that's why people sometimes hire professionals trained in communication and negotiation techniques with an understanding of family dynamics in order to help people with those conversations. So let's say people have been talking for a while. It's getting close to 2 hours when people agree to finish up. What are the next steps? What are the next steps? And it depends. People may feel like progress has been made. It's time to break. Allow folks to process what they've heard, get buy-in from other family members, etc. Or sometimes the parties have not made it to options, but they still feel like the time has been well spent. So let's examine possible outcomes more closely. You can see from reading this slide that there is a range of possible outcomes. And as you read through them, it is interesting to note that they may or may not match up with the initial goal set for the family meeting, and that's okay. So you've got a range of outcomes here, everything from just having a civilized conversation for the first time in a while to reaching temporary or even a final decision regarding a particular topic. And even when it's just a civilized conversation that begins to approach a solution, again, that can be a really positive step. For example, maybe you didn't decide that mom should move out of the house and into assisted living like you wanted, but you had the first productive conversation in a long time with everyone about what the relevant factors should be in making that decision. And people came away more open-minded to address this and other issues. And in the meantime, at least you came up with an agreement about how to communicate, email versus text going forward. That's progress. As you think about possible outcomes, it is also worth considering if your conversation gets stuck, think about what are the alternatives to reaching agreement. And when people think about that question, it sometimes focuses them and causes them to compromise more because they realize the alternative is less attractive. It can also have the opposite effect, asking that question, if people feel they hold leverage over others. Either way, it makes sense to consider the alternative to any proposed solution. Now let's turn to the 3 important skills that everyone needs in order to be successful in a family meeting, beginning with skill 1, listening to understand. So I have to preface this by saying many of us consider ourselves good listeners, but the truth of the matter is we are not. Steve Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, sums it up nicely. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And communication experts tell us that, in fact, most of the time, people do not listen well. On average, we listen at an effectiveness level of 25%. And if we're at home, listening to our spouse, for example, this listening effectiveness may fall to 10%. And we listen attentively only 20 minutes. And that's if we're really interested in a topic, which means, and I'm 30 minutes into this presentation, that I'm possibly in trouble. So we have to work hard to listen for understanding. That's what it means to have a learning conversation. One where people listen in order to truly understand another's needs, interests, feelings, values, and not one where you're thinking about how to respond or counter argument. But many people think to themselves, and I get it, I don't want to listen. And I've been there too. But remember, the main reason for listening to understand doesn't have to be you wanting to help the other person. It's to help you. Because the research is clear that people listen to you after you've listened to them. You show that you are listening in order to understand when you are able to reflect back for the person speaking what is heard, with all its nuance, by acknowledging specifics, summarizing, and sometimes by doing something that addresses what they've said. For example, if a sister tells you she doesn't feel appreciated for everything she does for mom, then show appreciation by buying her something thoughtful or figuring out a way to reduce her load. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. Skill 2, questions to understand. Asking good questions is a prerequisite for having a quality family conversation. Without asking good questions, reaching a workable, durable agreement to resolve outstanding issues is far less likely. So what are good questions? They include questions designed to bring clarity. And here we've listed 5 types. Questions to get information. What was said? What was seen? What happened? Questions to interpret meaning. What did you think it meant when I said XYZ? Questions to understand feelings. And we'll get to that in the next slide. And questions to learn about people's interests, concerns, and values. Again, we're not talking about people's arguments and their positions. A question to understand a concern over fairness, for example, could be, what makes what you're saying fair? And finally, it's important to ask questions in order to get clarity about behavior. That could be a question like, if we do what you are proposing, what does that look like? Or what happens if what you say turns out incorrect? Then what? Let's look at sample questions. Again, these are to design clarity. What do you need? What matters to you? The third question, do I have that right, is a great one. It's especially useful if someone has repeated themselves during the conversation, because sometimes people repeat themselves when they don't feel heard. So when you reflect back to them asking, do I have that right? Is there anything I missed? It reassures that person that you have listened to their point of view and they do feel understood. And again, when people feel like you understand them, they can open up their minds and hearts to do the same for you. Now let's look at the third skill, statements for understanding. So you want to use I statements as opposed to you statements like you did or you said, because they are less likely to make another person defensive and because they focus on you. And in a learning conversation, you get to share your own perspective. So instead of saying, you screwed up by XYZ, say, I got worried when you did not fill in the blank. Next, use and statements after someone has made their point and you want to transition to what you want to say, which is quite different. Instead of responding to something you disagree with by saying, I disagree, or that's BS, say, yes, and da 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 da. It may seem like a trivial point, but when you say yes and, people do not automatically tune out the same way as when you respond to their statement with, that's BS. And finally, reframe. So where two people have opposite perspectives about a situation, and that's not going to change, see if there is a way to reframe into a third statement that everyone can agree to, that you can use going forward to then solve the problem. So instead of you saying, Mom is getting sufficient care, and your brother saying she is not getting sufficient care, you can agree that there is an issue about what level of care is warranted and whether or not it is being provided. So now let's move from these three skills to a topic that is difficult but necessary to discuss, and it's feelings. The topic of feelings, identifying and understanding their meaning and what to do with them, is tricky. Entire fields of study are devoted to this topic. The point here is not to play psychologist, but rather to acknowledge well-established psychological principles relevant to conflict resolution. Elder mediators and some GCMs, social workers, they are all specifically trained to do that. When it comes to how people make decisions, there's a spectrum. On the one hand, people who make decisions based purely or mostly upon feelings. On the other hand, people that make decisions mostly on rational and on a logical basis. And people fall on different parts of that spectrum in terms of how much they let emotions factor into decision making. But we can say with confidence that emotion plays some part, even minimal, in conflict resolution. And that's because we're human. We're made up of complex emotions. So for those of you who would rather avoid talking about feelings, and again, I get you. I understand that instinct of wanting to solve a problem and just getting to the problem. But remember that feelings underlie most substantive disputes. So in order to problem solve, you need to first address feelings. And the key word here is productively. So how? By identifying and managing the feelings that directly connect to the issue at stake, that are not part of past history. You avoid talking about past slights and upsets. That's a rabbit hole that can be impossible to dig out of. Instead, each party should identify the emotions that drive the current conflict. Focus on the feeling you have now that drives conflict in the present. So let's make this more concrete. First, identify your own feelings for the other person. Again, only the ones that are relevant to the present conflict. Sentences like, I'm scared that I will bear the brunt of problems in the future because I live closer to mom or dad. I'm angry because I do way more than the rest of you, and we need to address this when we talk about mom's future care. And because feelings are a two-way street, as important as acknowledging your own feelings is acknowledging the other person's as well. Try sentences like, you are frustrated. I know. This is hard. I see that you are angry. Let's talk this through and see if I can better understand what's going on for you. Or, it sounds like you are jealous because mom gave me more money than you. A final point about emotions. On one hand, naming feelings in some cases can be easy, but oftentimes it's difficult work, and that's because they're hard to find. These feelings that are listed on the slide, love, anger, hurt, shame, loneliness, they often lurk under judgments and accusations, which are not feelings. Judgments and accusations are simply the attacks we make against another person that may feel good in the moment, but do nothing to resolve differences and make things better going forward. Consider the difference between saying, you are thoughtless, versus, I feel hurt when you don't take my opinion into account. Or contrast, you are self-absorbed, versus, I am annoyed when you say that my wishes matter because I see you focused on your own priorities. They sound different, don't they? One's a judgment and accusation. The other is explaining to the person you're feeling. So that's a lot to digest, I know. For many people, it is not second nature or to identify feelings that underlie interests or to use I statements, as I mentioned before. It feels more natural to say, you're a jerk, or worse, than to say, when you do X, Y, Z, it makes me feel scared. And it can be hard to train yourself in a way that you're not used to. And that's why families often turn to professionals who are trained and experienced at asking questions and using this type of language that is not second nature. Another important topic to address in family meetings is information and professional advice. What is needed and how to get it. Step 1, identify what information is needed. It could be health, financial, legal, or housing related. This can be simple or difficult to figure out depending upon the issue. And what information is needed will obviously vary from family to family. But to use healthcare as an example, during a family meeting, you might ask yourself, what information is needed in order to help my parent safely and effectively manage their own care? Manage simple yet chronic conditions. Remain independent if they've got complex comorbidities. Or find the right residential care when they require it. These are all the types of information people need to get. And that's why you go to people like geriatric care managers to get that information, as an example. Step 2, identify the person who will do the research. Sometimes it is the sibling further away because this is the way that they can help, or it's a sibling with expertise. And third, identify the professionals who can provide sage advice. There are obvious professionals that people know about, including lawyers and financial advisors, to name a few. But there are also professionals who specialize in helping families with aging loved ones. The Society of Certified Senior Advisors website lists professionals by specialty and geographic location, as does the website for aging life care managers. By now, you can appreciate many of the challenges and complexities involved with putting together a successful family meeting, I hope. With sufficient planning and preparation, people can do this on their own, but sometimes they want or need help. And that's where, like in the earlier slide at the beginning of the presentation, professionals step in. GCMs, social workers, some nurses, who are skilled at facilitating meetings and addressing common challenges. Sometimes, though, it makes sense to hire an elder mediator instead, especially if your situation involves many parties. Elder mediation is recognized as a preferred method for resolving disputes involving the care and needs of elders. And now I want to talk about what I like to call the secret sauce of elder mediation. While other professionals, such as aging life care managers, GCMs, therapists, elder attorneys, typically represent one party, elder mediators represent each and every family member equally. They do not simply explore the elder's goals and objectives. They help manage a process that gives voice to each person's goals and objectives. Oftentimes, elder mediators have baseline substantive knowledge that is relevant to the issues and decisions that families have to make. They understand common types of legal documents, as well as financial products, services, and areas of financial concern, and they know about useful government programs. This knowledge enables them to frame questions in such a way that family members can decide for themselves whether they need to obtain more information and advice as they move through mediation. While mediators may share general information, they do so very cautiously to avoid the appearance of preferring one party over another, and they never give advice. That is not their job. So let's say, for example, during mediation, everyone agrees that paying for care is an issue with no obvious answers, and someone mentions the existence of a life insurance policy. The mediator might pick up on that comment and ask, have you considered speaking with a professional about whether there is a way to sell the life insurance policy and access cash? That's something people do. Moving to the third bullet point. We've mentioned before that elder mediators are specifically trained in communication and negotiation. That's what makes them process experts who guide a conversation and negotiation between the parties rather than advise family members or make decisions for them. That's their job, to help guide a conversation. Being a process expert means a mediator can ask sensitive questions that the parties may not know how or be comfortable asking, precisely because he or she has no past history with any party and is perceived as fair. And because a mediator is trained and experienced at asking probing questions meant to clarify and find common ground, he or she can do so in a manner that elicits a helpful response and is less likely to provoke a negative reaction. And elder mediators can help the parties reframe their disputes. Like in that example I gave of the brother and sister who disagreed about whether mom was getting care. The brother says she is getting care, the sister says she's not getting care, and you reframe the dispute to there's an issue about the standard of care and whether it's being given. That's an example of reframing. So mediators can help the parties reframe their dispute and options in order to find that common ground. And finally, some mediators are trained specifically to handle family disputes involving high conflict people. These are people who have a hard time calming down and engaging in problem solving, who are preoccupied with blaming others. They have an all or nothing thinking and unmanaged emotions along with extreme behaviors. If you think that your family includes a high conflict person, I recommend checking out the High Conflict Institute, co-founded by Bill Eddy, and checking out his "So What's Your Proposal" method for solving conflict with high conflict people. And finally, in choosing to work with an elder mediator, it's a good idea to interview at least a couple to see who is a good fit. A few tips when you do. First, consider personal fit. You should feel comfortable with the person, like you can trust them right away to do right by you. Ask them about their mediation style and have them explain it to you. There is a big range in mediator philosophy. Second, ask if the mediator has completed elder mediation specific training beyond basic family mediation training. It's more specialized. It gets into the nuances of mediating with older people, especially in multi-party scenarios. Third, consider whether the mediator has baseline information or knowledge about some of the substantive areas that we talked about in the information section. That can be helpful. And finally, professional membership in mediation associations like Association of Conflict Resolution is a positive sign that a mediator keeps up with professional standards and trends. So returning to the roadmap for today's discussion, I know we've covered a lot. Everything from what family conflicts and family meetings are all about, to learning practical skills in order to be effective in a family meeting, covering special topics like capacity and feelings in more depth, and finally talking about elder mediation as an important resource for conflict resolution. So I want to conclude by just saying that when it comes to family and difficult conversations, next, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, be realistic about what's possible and what's not, and remember, it's a journey, a long journey, and there is no one path. Every family is different. Thank you everyone for joining us today, for your time and your interest. It's impossible to cover all relevant points in 1 hour, but I hope that at a minimum, I've planted new seeds with each and every one of you today, and that you feel more comfortable putting a family meeting together yourself or getting professional help if need be. And I just want to say, feel free to email me if you would like a copy of any of the educational tip sheets that I give clients, or if you're interested in being invited to my next Zoom brown bag lunch meeting, which is more informal and provides a lot of opportunity for questions and answers. I've included endnotes on the next slide so people have additional resources to consider. And again, I just want to say it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We have about 5 minutes before the hour. As you heard, it was a pretty a lot of information in the presentation. So we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. And while we're doing that, I was wondering, Lana, who is my colleague, I was wondering if you might run our poll, our evaluation poll, that people can answer at their leisure. But getting back to questions, we do have a number of them, Nicole. So first off, we have a listener who wanted to know. So we have a listener who has a parent, so an adult child, and they have a parent who does not apparently have any kind of advance directives or any of these kind of end-of-life documents. And they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to consider it. And the doctor has also, I guess, the parent's physician has asked for the adult child to follow up and try and get these documents taken care of. So what advice might you give for that person who's trying to get those documents filled out?
Well, that's a hard situation, not uncommon. I mean, there are a couple different ways to try to have that conversation. I mean, obviously, you want to try to pick a time and a spot when your parent is most kind of calm and alert and open. And there are different strategies that people employ. By the way, I should say, on my website there are links to articles that deal with the specifics of how to have particular different kinds of conversations. So there's a sheet about the conversation about driving, or a sheet about the conversation about, well, there's one about this issue, actually, I believe. And so you can look for those resources as well. But so that some of the different strategies people have will be, to talk about yourself. So instead of saying, you need to sign an advance directive, the doctor says to do it, I agree, you might talk about your own experience and why you prepared an advance directive, and give those reasons, and hope then that your parent can listen to that and then start thinking for themselves how they might do the same thing.
Perfect. Thank you. We've got another question from a listener. Let's see. They'd like to get advice on kind of getting agreement with family members who have, I guess, either alienated themselves from other family members, maybe not even with the questioner, but maybe there's some kind of disagreement, familial disagreement, or are quote unquote disagreeable. So what you might recommend for them to take on those challenges?
Well, I think, one of the main themes from this talk is really thinking about your own needs, interests, feelings, and then trying to really think about where another person is coming from, and try to do it in a way that avoids focus on, people's arguments and their positions. And so you start with thinking about your own feelings and what those are, identifying maybe, like I said in that one slide, there are things you need to work on yourself, and that's within your control. And then you can, think about how to approach them, about just having a conversation and letting them know that you would like to listen to them in order to understand them. And people know when you're being sincere and when you're not. So I think, if you're sincere about wanting a learning kind of conversation, and you've thought about your own feelings, and you, are open to doing that with them, all you can do is ask, but think about when the right time is to ask. It's not when someone's tired or stressed out, or you want to, there's a time and place for that. And just recognize that sometimes it's not possible, or maybe it's not possible today, but it's possible 6 months from now. But there's no easy answer for that question. But I think a lot of the themes that we talked about today if you look at the slides, you can use them as a starting point for how to take a next step.
Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question. Although before we get to that, Lana, would you mind going to the previous slide where people can see Nicole's information again? And the last question, let us see. Okay, we have a person who is interested in the talk and who has maybe some issues they'd like to try and resolve. But the problem is that the person they're trying to the person that they're trying to meet with just kind of resists direct communication and is maybe even difficult to get, to answer an email or to answer a phone call. What would you recommend for them to try and solve that?
I mean, sometimes writing a letter is a good idea. People aren't expecting letters as much as emails or texts these days, and it shows that you've given some thought. And just, explaining the situation from your perspective in a way, again, that avoids judgment and accusations, but really tries to focus on interests, concerns, and expresses a willingness to have a learning conversation. And again, you need to be realistic about what can and can't be accomplished. And, it's not always possible to bring someone to the table, but all you can do is try and recognize that sometimes initial resistance, 6 months down the road or a shorter or longer period of time, fades away and people are open. So you shouldn't necessarily get dejected if the first time you try to have a better conversation fails. But I keep coming back to this idea of a learning conversation. That's the goal. And if people hear that that's where you're coming from, they may be more receptive than they've been in the past.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole. I think that is all the time we have today. Nicole's information is up, of course, her email, and you can always sign up to her next brown bag meeting. So if you have other questions we weren't able to answer, please give Nicole, get in contact with Nicole. So this one, I think, is over. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. These webinars are a free and continuing series. You can find out about our next webinar on our website, which is caregiver.org. Next month, November, we're going to be talking stress management. So I'd like to thank Nicole and thank you all for joining us today. And also my colleague Lana, who was able to jump in at the last minute and solve a big technical challenge we had this morning. So I'm very grateful to Lana. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for hosting. And thank you for everybody for showing up.
Yeah, it's interesting times. I know in California, we've got a lot going on, but I know everybody has a lot on their plate. So we do appreciate, as Nicole said, for you to spend this time with us. So the webinar is concluded. We'll leave the survey up if you have a little bit of time. We'll leave the line open if you'd like to complete that. But for now, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you for the next webinar.
Bye.